I would.
Is that the same as like this
Yeah.
stuff? If you did that or
I would think so. It's probably better than mine. All right, kids. I want to warn you. This unit has a ton of information, and unfortunately, I have so much to say about this information that unlike other units where I'm just reading the book to you or doing a little extra research, my cup runneth over with miscellany and additional information, and this unit is just really close to my heart. I think that not only as a topic in environmental science, but as a topic in life, you should know a lot about this. So forgive me if I've made it too dense. I have a lot to say. Also keep in mind that 70 study goals is really intimidating, but it's still just 3 chapters, same as we had before. So all things considered, there's not necessarily more content. It's just broken up into a lot of smaller study goals. If you look at the amount of writing you've done in Unit 4, it's probably not too different from the amount you did in Units 1, 2, or 3. And it certainly should not be any less than you'll do in all the future units, at least the full-size units. Does anyone know where we left off the last time that we lectured? I guess that was yesterday.
I think we were talking about the crop, maybe a little bit after the spiral crop.
18, so we were talking about ways to avoid erosion, is that right?
Yeah.
We talked about contour plowing, mulch, no-till agriculture, and so on?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And had we talked about number 17, the different soil layers, or did we skip that to get to 18?
We did 17.
We did do 17? Then, as a way to prelude something else today, I'd like to point out one little detail that I guess I've already told you in number 17. You got the different zones because you all do your homework because you're all good kids. You already know the O, A, E, B, and C. You already know the soil, subsoil, bedrock, decomposed rock, and so on. But I want to remind you about the top couple of layers, the itty-bitty stuff at the top. Remember, topsoil is sand and silt and clay, and there's different types of topsoil. But don't forget the soil food web. That soil food web is where the nutrition of the soil comes from. Plants rely on all of these protozoans and amoebas and nematodes and bacteria to poop. Because those soil organisms, their waste products are the nutrients used by plants. Plant life needs nutrients. Those nutrients come from the soil organisms. And the soil organisms cannot survive without the raw ingredients which come from decomposition of organic material above. It's kind of a long story, and I'm going to bring this up again in another study goal. But remember the importance of organic material at the top of the soil to provide the raw ingredients that feed the food web that feeds the plants. Can you say that one more time? I promise I will when I come over here to number 23.
What does that say for selective thinning economically?
I'll do all that when we get there.
Horrible.
So we talked 18. I guess we're getting to number 20 next. Please look up. Remember that there's two ways to think about soil. There's the soil ecology, which we consider to be a more sustainable option, and the soil as a sterile medium, which we consider to be the less sustainable option. Soil as a sterile medium doesn't really work well for the long term, because you can't keep dumping bottles of chemicals into soil forever. Did you find it?
Yeah, because that was nice.
Did it record it? Did you put a little circle so I remember to record it? Thank you. Okay, check it out. One of the chemicals that we love to add to dirt is pesticide, because some types of farmers set out this giant buffet, an all-you-can-eat platter, a monoculture of broccoli for 10 square miles. That's pretty appetizing to the bugs, and of course they're going to go eat it. With all those bugs, the only alternative is pesticides. But I got to remind you that if you think of your farm as an ecosystem, those bugs aren't such a big deal. Here's a news flash for you. Of all the insect life on any farm, less than 5% of the species are pests to the farmer. It's safe to assume that at least 5%, maybe more, are actually beneficial insects. And the other 90-odd% are just parts of the soil ecosystem that are not beneficial insects, not pest species. They're just something else that lives in the dirt, like ants, termites. They don't eat the corn, they don't eat the broccoli, they don't help the corn, they don't help the broccoli, they just live there.
So the reason why pests come back so fast is because they have all the resources there, and when you kill everything else, there's no way for them to come back?
Well, there's no way for them not to come back.
Yeah.
The reason that pests return is because you've left the giant buffet, and you've removed their predators, you've removed their competitors, so of course they're going to resurge.
Yeah.
So number 20 is a more sustainable method to think about bugs. It's not just getting rid of the bugs, it's figuring out how to keep the population under control. You should know that most farmers that I deal with, they're okay with a few bugs. If you have a polyculture, oh no, the row of broccoli has aphids, well, we'll just sacrifice the broccoli, distract the aphids, and we'll harvest everything else on the farm. Because if you have a polyculture, you lose a little bit of one crop, who cares? Most farmers just want to manage the population. Okay. IPM is integrated pest management. And anytime you see integrated, that means a blend of options, many ideas. Integrated pest management is a blend of methods. Basically, like a Swiss Army knife, except you open everything at once. So it's all the things you can do for the bugs short of gnarly pesticides. That means beneficial species, polyculture, crop rotation. There are beneficial ways to irrigate. So some bugs just don't like water, or if you change the timing of the water, the bugs don't take off as quickly. So you can control a lot of pests by either drowning them with a sprinkler or keeping them dry using drip irrigation. Different pests can be controlled simply with how you irrigate or when you irrigate. A really common method of pest control on organic farms is just improving airflow. you space out the rows a little bit, and with more airflow, the good bugs can find the bad bugs more easily. Airflow. Let me finish the list, and then I'll get to you. There are some plants which keep away bugs. It's called companion planting. So you guys know that tobacco is bad for you because nicotine is poison, right? Well, it works pretty well on killing humans, but it works pretty well on killing bugs too. If you mix in a little tobacco with your tomato, the bugs stay away because, they know not to mess with tobacco. We call that companion planting. You can bring in beneficial insects by planting what are called native insectaries. That's a little native garden that draws in beneficial insects. And if all else fails, one of the options in integrated pest management is obviously, some chemicals. I have to remind you that even on organic farms, some chemicals, if it's the last resort, are either a good idea or the only solution. The time that I went to go visit my buddy's organic farm up in NorCal, I was looking for an organic farm. And when I followed the directions, I kept seeing this guy on a tractor pulling a big spray rig, wearing a respirator and a plastic suit. And I was like, dang it, this guy gave me bad directions. I followed his directions perfectly, and it brought me to this stupid farm where this guy's spraying chemicals. So eventually, I just gave up, and I parked, and I was like, hey, bro, can you help me find Jacques Newcomb? He's like, actually, that's me. This is the farm. We have to spray because on peach farms, we occasionally have no other way to prevent leaf curl than to use a sulfur spray. And that's organically allowed because it is the only alternative. So remember that in integrated pest management, you just minimize pesticide. You don't avoid all pesticides at all times. You just try other stuff, so you need less chemicals. So there was a question over here earlier, and a question over here.
What was it, the breeze flow, like spacing out crops, does that also limit bugs jumping from one crop to another, or will they still get across no matter the distance?
It seems reasonable, but I'm pretty sure that most bugs have pretty good mobility. But yeah, maybe they don't reach that critical mass. Maybe it lowers their reproductive rate because they have more trouble finding each other. I'm not sure if you're spacing out the crops to keep the bugs away from their partners or just to increase airflow. My understanding was that it makes it more accessible to the good bugs. If you plant really dense tomatoes, a lot of the good bugs just can't see their prey. But if you spread them out a little bit, then it makes it easier for the hunters to eat the pest bugs.
Do farmers use those methods all the time, or all of them at once, or just depending on what they're farming?
I think it just depends on the farmer. The concept of integrated pest management is to blend methods. So the idea is, hey, instead of just using chemicals, why don't we try some other stuff too? There isn't, to my knowledge, a single recipe for integrated pest management. It's whichever blend of methods works in your area, your pest, your crops. Anybody else? Cool. Study goal number 21 is about the problems with genetically modified crops. And I have to warn you, this is really tricky to explain. Your book, in my opinion, does not really discuss these issues. Your book talks about some other stuff. But I wanted to clarify a couple of separate issues. First of all, in period 3, did we already discuss Bacillus thuringiensis, BT?
Yeah.
Bacillus thuringiensis is a naturally occurring bacteria that lives in dirt. Bugs don't eat this bacteria. So scientists thought, that's weird, nothing eats this bacterium. And we found out that the bug is toxic to that the bacterium is toxic to bugs. It turns out that Bacillus thuringiensis, which from now on I'll describe as BT, because it's kind of easier to say, okay? That BT is toxic to bugs. They can't eat this bacterium. The bacterium makes a pesticide inside of it that keeps bugs from eating it. That is the name of a bacterium. It lives in the soil that's naturally occurring. But this led to a genetic modification. Because we looked in the bacterium, we figured out the gene that makes it toxic, took out that gene, and now we make BT corn, BT cotton, BT soy. These crops, every cell in the plant is toxic to bugs. Because we took the toxin gene from the bacterium and we put it into genetically modified crops. You gotta admit, it's a pretty good idea. You don't even need pesticides. You just use the plant that makes its own pesticide. Yeah?
Is it toxic to humans?
Apparently not. Apparently it's toxic to invertebrates, but because we have a spine, some difference in our system means that it should not be toxic to humans or other animals. So one of the really famous genetic modifications is BT, making plants that produce their own pesticide. Of course, that's a really good idea because you don't have to spray pesticides. The GMO companies are like, hey, look, this is a really good alternative. If you want to make pesticide-free products, grow our BT genetically modified stuff, and you don't need to use pesticide because the plant is itself the pesticide. Of course, this is one of the big concerns ecologically, because the pollen that comes out of those plants is also a pesticide. So it kills bees, kills butterflies. Those are beneficial insects. It kills pollinators that we need to grow our food. So one of the concerns is the genetic contamination of other crops with BT genes. This, genetic contamination. Now remember, if Graham is a conventional farmer in Kansas, he can choose whether or not he wants to grow BT corn, and that's his business, and I got no problem with that. Free market, whatever. But here's a news flash for you. Corn is wind pollinated. So if somebody in Kansas has BT corn, that pollen can travel pretty far. Maybe to Texas, maybe to Mexico, maybe to Honduras. And so people have found genetically modified genotypes in plants hundreds or even thousands of miles away. It's called genetic contamination. Where now, somebody who did not want genetically modified ingredients in their crop has been pollinated by genetically modified pollen, and now those genes are being carried. It's like you can choose who you breed with, hopefully. But corn cannot. The corn's just sitting there. The pollen lands on the corn, and that corn will have little babies that are half GMO. Yeah.
I thought in the article they said the reason they didn't know how the trans genes or whatever were getting, that plant was getting it, was because corn pollen was too heavy to move by wind.
I don't think that's accurate, no. And there has been this debate about how much genetic contamination happens, and corn might be a bad example.
So that article wasn't real?
maybe I'm misspeaking, I don't know. But I do believe that corn is, I know for a fact that corn is wind pollinated. That is an absolute certainty. The range of the corn, I may have exaggerated about Mexico for that particular species.
Well, they said for 60 miles they didn't know how the corn was pollinated because it was too heavy or whatever.
Wasn't that
The whole
cold?
article was like, we had no idea, but the fact is they are getting pollinated. They just had no idea. They said it was too heavy for wind and it was just getting pollinated.
I know for a fact, like fact, the reason that you cannot grow corn as a few individuals is because the only way to transmit their pollen is by wind. So farmers are supposed to plant corn in blocks to optimize wind pollination. The range of the corn, I could stand corrected about how far it'll go. I make no assertions about that. But as a concept, you can imagine if it's not corn, then maybe canola. The fear is that genetically modified genes can be carried by wind or water or pollinators or some other method and spread from GMO populations to non-GMO populations. Yeah?
That's the same thing that Monsanto did with their seeds, though, right? So they allowed corn and canola to crossbreed with other people's crops without their consent.
And then you bust that person for stealing the genes. Yeah, exactly.
They must then.
Yeah, I know for a fact that corn is wind pollinated. Like most other grasses, by the way. Now, this makes a problem for people in other parts of the world because there's another really famous gene called the terminator gene. I got to remind you of something. For thousands and thousands of years, when people grow food, they save some seeds so that next year they can grow the food again. It's called seed saving. And there's nothing really fancy about it. You know, you're growing some corn, you eat 90%, but you let 10% dry out so you can save the seeds for next year. No big deal. But, of course, if I'm Monsanto and I spent $10 million to develop this one really fancy corn, I don't want you to save seeds. I want you to come back and buy it from me next year, right? So many genetically modified seed producers include what's called, please look up, the terminator gene, which is intended to sterilize your seeds. Sure, go ahead, try to save your seeds, they won't sprout. The terminator gene prevents your next generation seeds from being viable. Does that make sense? You know, that way, you buy them in 2013, and in 2014, you can't grow from your own seed. You got to go back to Monsanto to buy it from them again. It's a perfectly reasonable business decision, I think. Of course, imagine the problem if that gene spreads around. On this side of the fence, you bought from Monsanto, you can't save your seeds, that's your problem, you knew that it works, they told you in the papers, that's how it works. You know, that's your call. But over here, you're trying to be an organic farmer that likes to save their seeds, and if the pollen from this side of the fence falls on your farm, all of a sudden you cannot save your own seeds. Next year, you go to plant your crop using your own seed like you have for decades, and most of them don't sprout. In the U.S., we might say, ooh, business bummer for your crop. You know, I'm sorry, farmer, you got a little screwed by your neighbor. But in many parts of the world, if the terminator gene spreads, people who are subsistence farmers that grow their own food, they just don't get that crop that year, and they might have to go hungry. You have to understand, I'm perfectly okay with business practices that are fair and transparent. It just scares me when we impose the consequences of those business decisions on people that were not a part of the game. So this is what I mean by seed-saving problems and the terminator gene. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. You see one of the main reasons that a lot of people say, oh, no pesticide, we can sprout now? Like on layers, like no pesticide.
I'm going to assume no. But it's an interesting question, right? Like, it would be the follow-up question. So you don't use pesticide? Is that because you're using Bt seeds? Most of the time that a farmer says pesticide free, my assumption is that they just haven't gone through with all the paperwork to get an organic certification, which is very expensive and difficult for many farmers. But it's a good question. You could certainly grow Bt food and call it pesticide free, I think. Some of my last problems with GMOs are limited health testing. Because it's still a tomato, you don't have to do any specialized testing on how that works inside people's metabolism. So there's been very little, if any, testing on how genetically modified foods affect the health of the consumer. And finally, my last concern with genetically modified foods is probably not easy if you don't understand a funny thing about biology. If you've had AP Bio, this is obvious, but for the rest of you, genes do not have a single function only. Let me say that again. Genes do not have just one function. A lot of genes have their primary function, which is to produce a protein, and then they have a secondary function, which is to regulate another gene. So for example, maybe the gene for blonde hair has an impact on the amount of growth in your bone growth plates, and it makes you taller too. I just made that up. I'm sure that's not accurate, but the point is primary function and secondary functions. A lot of people are really scared that we always figure out the primary function of a gene, but we cannot map all the secondary functions. Of special concern is the possibility that some genes may impact allergies, which I think is a highly speculative issue, but it does show that we would like to do more testing, I think, than we currently have for genetically modified crops. You understand what I mean about the multiple functions and secondary impacts? Unintended genetic consequences. Yeah?
I think like something like a lawsuit, you'd be able to get stuff labeled again, GMOs.
You know, labeling is a really hot topic on genetically modified foods. It's a big deal to me. I got to move on, but I'll just tell you that a gross majority of the American public would like to know what they're eating. Public opinion polls, depending on how you ask the question, show 60 to 80% support of labeling genetically modified foods. One study showed more than 90% nationwide people want to know if they're eating genetically modified foods, or at least they wouldn't mind if their food was labeled. Right now, your food has to tell you this contains may contain soy and other tree nuts because of allergies, for example. A lot of people want food labeling. And so the public at large generally supports more information about what they're putting in their bodies, but that's not a really profitable pursuit. There's no money to be made. But if you don't know that there's genetically modified stuff in your food, you're more likely to eat it. So there's a ton of profit to be made by you not knowing. So like what happened in California last year, we had a really popular initiative to label foods in California if they contain genetically modified foods. And right at the end of the electoral cycle, out-of-state money flooded the state with advertisements that confused the issue, created panic about the cost. Like, oh my God, it's going to raise the price of your food. As if you didn't already have a bunch of labels printed for your food as it is. Said that, oh, some food is going to be labeled and some isn't. This is an imperfect law. You shouldn't vote for it. And so the state initiative started in the high 60s for support, was hovering around high 50s, mid 60s, getting right into the last couple of weeks of the election cycle. And in those last couple of weeks, a flood of out-of-state money, the pro-labeling side was outspent 5-1. Confused the issue and lost public support, and we didn't get labeling in our state. The same thing's currently happening in Washington, where public opinion is very high in favor of labeling foods. They have a state initiative coming up in like 2 weeks or something. And there was just this giant flood of genetically modified producer money from out of state to combat what seemed like a snowball of support for labeling. I just think it makes sense that we should know what we eat. Like, I don't care. I mean, everything should be labeled. I think people should understand that organic doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. I don't think that labeling should just be for the hippies. I think that everybody needs to know better what they're eating. But that's just an opinion. That's not science. I was just talking about me there. Take that or leave it. Any questions about number 21? Problems with GMO? I have to very, very quickly make a connection for you, and I promised you I would say it again. Here it comes. You're probably going to want to scramble to write this. Skip the little words. Here we go. Watch me. This is number 23. Watch. Watch this. This is going to be really long, so just use the words and then you can link it up later. Overgrazing. Primary cause of desertification. Because, watch this, here it goes. Organic material is the foundation of the soil food web. And the soil food web is the source of soil nutrients. I'm going to repeat it quickly this time. And you should just be able to see this already having been written. Overgrazing is the primary cause of desertification because organic material is the foundation of the soil food web, and that soil food web is how soil gets its nutrition. Here's a different way to write that if you want. Watch me. Overgrazing means no organic material. ... No soil food web, ... no soil nutrition equals desertification. Now I'll just say it in plain old English in case you're trying to figure out what the hell you wrote on your paper. You know, if the cows eat all the grass, there's nothing left to decompose. With nothing decomposing, there's no bugs to poop in the dirt. So the dirt runs out of poop, and then the plants can't grow in sterilized soil. Overgrazing is the primary cause of desertification because when you eat all the stuff off the top of the dirt, there goes all your nutrient supply. The bugs in the soil run out of food. And then with no bugs in the soil, the dirt becomes a desert. Yeah?
And with the tillage concept, there still is like organic materials just mixed in, made finer?
Yeah, precisely. So the ideal combination would be lots of organic material constantly being mixed into the soil so that you can speed up the decomposition, support more bugs, and get more nutrients in the dirt for your plants. So the way that we manage our garden is we try to leave as much organic material on the dirt as possible, and as soon as it gets small and broken up, we mix it into the dirt so that we can speed up decomposition, feed the bugs, get them all pooping, and get more nutrients available in dirt.
And so the reason tillage would be bad is because a lot of it's lost due to how fine it is, or
Well, tillage, if you have a lot of organic material, just sort of speeds up what happens in nature. But tillage, if you don't have organic material, makes the dirt more friable and then lets it erode more easily. I got to remind you of one last thing about desertification. And I've written this on the board, so you might be able to interpret it from your notes as they are currently written. Please look up. Desertification is also known as nutrient erosion. In other words, the loss of fertility. Once your dirt doesn't have nutrients, then plants don't grow. And thus, desertification often leads to erosion. Desertification is not erosion. Desertification is when your dirt becomes like a desert, and then with nothing growing there, it's easier to lose it in erosion. That's a big tangle of words. I'd love to answer any questions, but now I'm just repeating myself. Questions? Yes?
Wait, desertification leads to erosion or the other way?
Desertification leads to erosion. Because what does desertification mean? That the dirt doesn't have any nutrients, right? Like a desert. And so if your dirt doesn't have any nutrients, there's nothing growing there. It's just dirt. And you know that exposed dirt will wash away or blow away in the wind, right? So desertification, when your dirt becomes lifeless, makes it easier for that dirt to erode. The opposite of desertification is well-fertilized, nutrient-rich dirt. And that's a place where plants are going to grow like crazy. So that makes it kind of hard for it to erode because plants are growing like crazy. So when you lose the nutrients, then you lose the plants, and thus the dirt is more likely to erode. Yes?
Wait, I don't know if I heard you wrong. For desertification, you said it leads to erosion, but it's not erosion?
That's right. They're different terms. Erosion is the physical loss of dirt, like stealing. But desertification is a decline in the quality of the dirt. Yes?
can you have erosion without desertification?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In a really nice forest, when you clear cut, erosion is unavoidable, even if that dirt's of really good quality. Because by removing the plants, there's just nothing to anchor it. So you can take beautiful dirt and let it erode too. But by making the dirt lower quality, it's more likely to erode. Does this make sense to you?
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any questions on 4.2? We're about one study goal behind the last period, so I'm going to speed it up if there are no questions. I promise we'll get to all of that, and I'll read every one of those words. Vocab questions on 4.3.
In the study guide, you said to ask you to make a point of thinning and patchiness.
The first thing I'm going to talk about as a study goal is patchiness and thinning. So are there any other vocab terms on 4.3? All right. Dominance, codominance, suppression, and so on are about which trees dominate the canopy. So when you guys look at pictures of Tuolumne Meadows, like that one, or that picture, and that picture, and that picture, this picture, almost all my pictures, you might notice that all the trees are the exact same. Because in Tuolumne Meadows, at 9,000 feet, the forest is dominated by lodgepole pine. If you're looking at the top of the trees, every one of them is lodgepole pine, one species. It is a dominant species. The top of the forest is dominated by one. If you hike downhill a few thousand feet, get down to Yosemite Valley at like 5,000, in Yosemite Valley, you look down at the forest from the top of El Cap or something, and the forest is mixed. There is a codominant canopy, where you've got some lodgepole, some red pine, some yellow pine, some white pine, some black oaks, some cottonwoods, and 1,000 other trees I can't remember. Dominance is if one species rules the canopy of the forest. Codominance is if there are many. And then what were the other two terms that come right after that?
Intermediate.
Yeah, so intermediate are the trees that are not quite in the canopy. So those might be some hardwoods below the big conifers. And the suppressed are the trees that are kind of stuck in the shade unless somebody falls over. Other vocab on 4.3?
What was stand?
Stand is like a grove of trees. A stand of trees is a grove of trees. Yes?
Conservation corridors.
Those are little lines of protected space that connect conservation areas. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in lecture tomorrow. But they connect preserved landscapes. Yes?
Sustainable forestry.
Kind of like it sounds, it's logging that you can keep doing over and over. It is sustainable, so you can do the same thing many times over. Anybody else? So, we've talked a little bit about number 25. You might remember when we talked about the biomes, I told you that chaparral is a fire renewal community. You guys remember that term? By the way, you guys are doing a great job. I know that all of this yelling at you is kind of a nightmare. We only had 8 minutes. Tough it out with me. We're doing good. Fire renewal communities are ecosystems where fire is a helpful force. It helps turn all the leftover nutrients in the plants back into dirt nutrition. So watch. Places like Santa Barbara should look like this, where the forest is patchy. Patchiness is like a quilt pattern where little patches of forest have different ages. Please look up. Burned 40 years ago, burned 1 year ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, 5 years ago. These are the patches. Patchiness is a pattern in a forest where a fire will start from natural causes like lightning strike. But you know that fire is not going to be the kind of fires that you remember in the Santa Barbara front country, because the fire can only spread so far before it hits ashes from last year's fire right here. Or a big wet grassy patch, because that burned 5 years ago. It's pretty green and lush. It's not very flammable. Does that make sense to everybody? That young forests aren't going to burn as quickly as that little chunk that hasn't burned in 100 years. So, watch what happens. Fire starts in a patchy forest, and it goes burn, 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 and then it just fizzles. You know, if the wind blows, it might get into this patch, which is probably flammable. But no matter what, it's not going to get into this patch, it's just ashes. And it's not going to get into this patch, that's like a grassland. Does that make sense to everybody? So, watch what happens. In a patchy forest, fires are smaller and cooler, which means they recover more quickly. You know, if this thing catches on fire, there's still grass seeds that are going to help it recover. And there's still a bunch of trees over here that'll throw some seeds this way. And there's still some intact habitat so that the animals can come back. So it'll recover more quickly. And because it recovers faster, you get less erosion and less impact on wildlife. This is the natural order of affairs in a patchy forest. Better be quick.
Yeah, so patchiness is a natural phenomenon. It's not something that we do.
That's right.
Do
Patchiness is a natural phenomenon that happens in a normal fire renewal community.
Don't we exaggerate a little bit too so that it prevents fire?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Now, the problem is that for a long time, we didn't know that. So if a fire started in the forest, we'd send in the hot shots and the crews to put out the fire, put out the fire, put out the fire, save the forest, save the forest! Stupid Smokey the Bear always said, save the forest, save the forest, save the forest! And now, we've dealt with fire prevention forests, where you haven't had a fire in like 100, 150 years. That's a really different forest. If you haven't had any fire, you've accumulated fuel. All the trees are maxed out, meaning they've taken all the nutrients they can get from the soil. Everything is locked up in biomass. So the trees are maxed out. They're starving. They can't get anything else out of the dirt. They're all packed shoulder to shoulder with dry kindling everywhere. We call that a tinder box. A dense forest of starved, dry trees. And you've seen what happens when a fire starts in that forest, because that's every forest you've been alive for in Santa Barbara. Some of you have unfortunately painful memories of this. Anybody lose a home in a recent fire? I'm sorry to hear about that. You know, like so many of us in Santa Barbara, I evacuated 6 times in 2 years. You know that these fires are giant. They're really crazy hot. So hot that nutrients in the soil will literally evaporate. And this sterilizes the soils and it kills the seeds. Plus, it burns the whole landscape. So there's no nutrients in the dirt, there's no seeds in the dirt, and there's no trees nearby to give you seeds. There's no chunk of intact forest to give you wildlife. Now you're screwed. Because when a fire hits this type of forest, recovery is very slow. Erosion is a major problem. And some of you have noticed that many of our burned areas have not recovered yet. You might know that erosion after the last big fires was a giant nightmare. And so what are we going to do? The bell's going to ring, but I'd like to finish this. The best solution we can come up with now is to artificially recreate patches by quote-unquote thinning the forest. Will says, aren't we trying to recreate patchiness? And yes, that's what controlled burns, managed fires, that's the idea. To thin out some clumps of this forest to artificially recreate that patchy pattern. Anybody have any questions about patchiness versus thinning?
It's sort of a situation happening in
Well, most parts of the world haven't had the money to prevent fires in the wilderness. And there are many ecosystems where fire is not a rejuvenating factor, but especially in the United States, nationally owned land has almost all been fire prevention. And so now we need thinning because we've lost patchiness in Yosemite, Santa Barbara, Colorado, Alaska, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, almost any place you can think of.
3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Damn it.
I'd like to make one clarification. I do not mean to suggest that we not protect life and property. When a fire gets close to your house, of course we got to stop it. But we used to put out fires 500 miles from people.